Global Land Initiative and UNCCD Pavilion at the Global Landscapes Forum in Nairobi. How are you doing? This event is also being live streamed, so welcome to everyone joining us online as well. It's being co-organized with the UN Decade and UN Environment. And we have an esteemed panel of speakers today who will highlight their work under the UN Decade and under other restoration challenges. So to start our session, I want to introduce Jean-Philippe Salcido Villanueva, who is the Partnership Coordinator for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So thank you, JP. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Thank you to UNCCD as well, to the G20 Global Land Initiative, of course, for the invitation. My name is Jean-Philippe Salcedo. I was kindly invited to basically give the background, a quick introduction on the UN Decade, and that is, of course, something I'm very, very, very pleased to do. So I think we have some slides that will be projected. I will already get started quickly. So, to get us all up to speed, if you should not have heard about the UN Decade quite yet, then there's work for us to do, and glad that you're here. Welcome to all the participants. Mandated by a UN General Assembly resolution in 2019, the UN Decade is to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide and across all ecosystems. It is up. Perfect. Let me see. Here we go. Perfect. We work across three pillars. The first is to build a global movement that is focusing particularly, but not exclusively, on communication and advocacy. The second is, of course, to increase political will, but also improve the framework conditions for restoration. And last but not least, monitoring. Monitoring, to some, may sound a tiny bit nerdy, let's be very honest, but you will know why exactly it is so keen. It is so keen that we improve, and we have made really important progress already on that front, but I'm sure that the discussion will also land on the monitoring side. Now, it is based on science. What I mean by that is it is not out of the void, quite the contrary. Science is clear in telling us that conservation, unfortunately, is simply not enough anymore. We do need restoration to reach our global goals, to avoid the mass biodiversity loss, to limit climate change, and the time is now. It sounds like a phrase which is overused. The time is now. This decade is crucial. We have heard that before in the last decade, but to be honest, it's unfortunately simply true. The reason is, like, the longer we wait, the more difficult it will simply be, maybe to the point of stepping over some thresholds. So the time really is now, and I think we probably agree that the awareness about the importance of restoration is increasing worldwide. Not sure it is still screened. There we go. Don't you worry, I'm going to be very quick on that. But this is an important slide. And what it shows is that this is an initiative. Obviously, you have two co-leading entities behind it, UNEP and FAO, but it is an entire partner network, and it has been mandated to us by the resolution itself that we do work across the MEAs, across UN entities, global partners, and a large partner network, and we are now at over 250 partners representing the largest restoration alliance in the world, ranging from global heavyweights, let's say, to the very important and largest group, which are the so-called actors, the restoration implementers on the grounds or in the seas, or the ones that, you know, create the restoration economy. That means from providing seedlings, for example, or engage in rallying funds, for example, for specific, locally specific restoration actions. There are 5 task forces. Each of them would merit a session on its own, so I'm just going to read them out, but it's important that we know that we do have them. These are best practices led by FAO, as well as a monitoring one, a finance task force led by the World Bank. We have a science task force and a youth task force, and the youth task force is self-led, relying on the MGCY mechanism to UNEP and the youth engagement mechanisms to FAO. So self-led, and that is, I hope we all agree, extremely important that it is. Maybe I tried over my it does work a bit better. Perfect. So why are we here, or how does the Land Challenge come in? Well, not only mandated by our strategy, but over the course of the first years, key partners approached us and asked, so how exactly are we taking it seriously, the mandate that key partners are to lead on behalf of the UN decade? And that is through a so-called action plan. We had vast consultative processes on this. The entire partner network, and I see many of the partners here in the room and probably online as well, they identified the main 12 gaps. Gaps in terms of specific ecosystems, in terms of specific impact of restoration, or in terms of specific stakeholders. And to provide an answer, it's this partner network that also proposed so-called challenges. 31 challenges in numbers, very different in terms of content, who leads on them. In terms of numbers, we have over 40 partners now, including UNCCD, for example, which we are discussing today on the Land Challenge, that lead on them and that lead on behalf of the UN decade. And this is pretty unique. I know there are several UN decades, and I'm slightly biased, so they are all great and valuable, but in terms of its architecture and in terms of its approach, I would say that is pretty unique approach, which we are, I must admit, a bit proud of, at least from the feedback that we have from partners. It seems to be working quite well. Just as an example, we'll discuss the Land Challenge, but one example of what else is out there is a freshwater challenge. You may have heard about it, launched at UN Waters in New York this year. The UN Decade is not about setting new goals. We have many goals. It's an action platform to help achieve them, but in certain areas, or in terms of certain ecosystems, for example, it provides a platform for different partners, 6 in concrete numbers here, to come together and use that platform to launch specific goals, specific challenges. In this case, it was to restore, or it is to restore 300,000 of kilometers of rivers, 350 million hectares of wetlands, comparable more or less, I think, roughly 7 times around the world for the former, the size of India roughly for the latter. And this is spearheaded by countries. You know, we have a lot of commitments. I do agree we need more, but what we also probably agree is that we focus more on the implementation, and these are exact pathways on how to achieve this. Right. This is actually pretty much the last point, because it's linked to the second big initiative, I would say, under the UN Decade, which are the World Restoration Flagships. And you may have heard about these flagships, launched in 2021 through call to governments and partners to lead on the submissions, is to tell us where are the best large-scale restoration efforts in the world. Why is that important? It is because there is still a big question mark often on the quality of the implementation, on where these sites exactly are, and how can these successful cases really inspire others as well. And it's not the complete picture, don't get me wrong, but we do focus on a certain large scale level, because this is what we need to reach in the end if we were really to implement, for example, on terrestrial ecosystems, the 1 billion hectares that we count having been committed. And the action plan, and in the second step, the land challenge, part of its goals or expected outcome is that it leads also to future flagships. The first 10 have been announced this year. I really invite you to go on the website, watch the documentaries that have been produced on them, look at the stories, also on the human stories that come out of these flagships. They are absolutely fascinating. And we are to see the next call for nominations by the end of this year, beginning of next year. So that is coming up. The first call was very successful. We could have awarded more. Don't get me wrong, we could have. In total, we received almost 80 government-endorsed nominations. Government-endorsed means, you know, we had 160 expressions of interest, almost 80 then led to actual nominations. And them together, they represent roughly 250 million hectares, so roughly 1/4 of the 1 billion committed in terms of terrestrial ecosystems again. So it does tell us the story of where to look. We can look at a map now and pinpoint such restoration initiatives at large scale again, not the full picture. I'm conscious of that. But I think these success stories are really important to tell. Right, and with that, thank you so much. 25 seconds more for you. Here we go. Thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank you, JP, for that great overview on the UN decade. Realize I only have 2 hands. So, okay, so thank you. So my name is Joanne Lee. I lead stakeholder engagement at the G20 Global Land Initiative and UNCCD. I'm joined here with my colleague Apurva Bose, who leads our capacity building. So maybe while our great tech team is putting up my slides, I can just get started. As you know, there's several global commitments related to land. And the first one is to achieve a target of land degradation neutrality by 2030, and that's under the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. The next is to ensure that 30% of degraded areas are under effective restoration by 2030, and that's under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 2. And last one is to reduce 50% of degraded land by 2040, and that's the G20 Global Land Initiative target. And so altogether, the global community has committed to restore 1 billion hectares of land by 2030. And for those who may not know, the G20 Global Land Initiative was launched by the G20 leaders at the Riyadh Summit in 2020. The group of 20 is a group of the world's largest economies, which includes 19 countries and the European Union, and recently the African Union has joined as well. Yes, and so building on these existing commitments, the ambition is to achieve a 50% reduction in degraded land by the year 2040. So we have 4 pillars of action. Hopefully my slides come up soon. The first is to showcase success stories that benefit nature and safeguards people's lives, jobs, and incomes. The second is to engage the private sector and to increase investments for land restoration. The third is to empower civil society and the public in land stewardship. And the last pillar is to share knowledge and develop and mobilize capacity, including between the G20 members as well as non-G20 countries. So the Land Restoration Challenge, it's led by the G20 Global Land Initiative and UNCCD. And we had an open call for expression of interest since the 16th of August. And it was open to the UN Decade partners. And we received a lot of interest in joining the Land Restoration Challenge. There were over 110 responses. And so when you see the overview of the different stakeholder groups who expressed an interest to join the Land Restoration Challenge, there were a lot of non-governmental organizations. There's also representatives from government as well as the private sector, youth organizations, women organizations. It was very varied amongst the different stakeholder groups. And there was also various areas of expertise related to land restoration, including land rights, agriculture, forestry, water and watersheds. So our key performance indicators for 2024 include organizing an annual event for parliamentarians to sensitize them about the legal and policy developments in the domain of land restoration. And we also want to train at least 1,000 agripreneurs on land restoration and reach at least 1,000 universities with a curriculum. And we also want to create a platform for sharing best practices and also discussing the work of other land actors, and also the collaborative work that we do with the UN Decade. And we also want to organize a series of trainings and events for capacity building and to discuss opportunities in land restoration. A previous example, we've started off these events for parliamentarians. Earlier this year in August, we had an event in Bonn. It's called the Global Changemaker Academy for Parliamentarians. It was a 5-day leadership academy for parliamentarians from around the world. And it was organized in collaboration with the UN System Staff College, and there were 29 participants from 24 countries. We also held the Youth Agripreneur Award on land restoration with the International Trade Center. There were over 87 submissions in a week, and from applicants from 34 countries, and we selected 10 finalists, and some of them are actually in this room. So there's Mashroor, if you want to raise your hand, and Makwena, and Mause. So please do reach out to them after this event. Yes, and we also want to open up a small grants program for land restoration projects, and we want to support up to 50 projects undertaken by NGOs and communities. The award would be $5,000 to $20,000 US per partner, and so this open call will be provided for the Land Restoration Challenge partners as well as UNCCD accredited organizations. And ideally, the funding should be used to upscale and elevate planned or ongoing efforts. Mm-hmm. Caught all that while I was zooming on the screen. Next, we are planning with C4 ECRAF and several other partners a global course on innovative agricultural solutions for land restoration. And you can see the various topics. And the next one. I'm zooming through the slides. Okay, and so we have an upcoming workshop on assessing land degradation dynamics and restoration efforts with remote sensing data and GIS tools. So the application closes on 31st of October, so feel free to register. On the next slide, these are some examples of the previous trainings that we've had related to the restoration of mining sites and biosaline agriculture, which is upcoming. Unfortunately, the application period has closed for that one. And the next slide, we just want to highlight this new website that we will be launching on land restoration. It'll include various national pledges from various sources from different countries. And next slide will also highlight various legislation and policies that different countries have enacted related to land restoration. And on the next slide, we also hope to have a page on restoration actors and other databases. So this will include a page on the land restoration actors as well as a page on the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration. And next slide, we also will have various learning opportunities and videos available on this platform. We also hold a various series of webinars. So we have this Let's Talk Land webinar series. We've had previous examples related to nature-based solutions, disaster risk reduction, and also recently on tech-enhanced land restoration and DRR. Next, we also have the hybrid brown bag lunch series, and these are some of the examples that we've held in the past. and we'd love to partner with you to organize these webinars as well. So if you're interested, please do reach out to us. Next, we also we have these trainings usually for UNCCD related to land issues, but we want to open this up also to the land challenge actors. And some of you also attended the previous one, so it was great to have you there. Lastly, we currently have a photo competition. The theme is beautiful landscapes, and the aim is to celebrate the beauty of landscapes while encouraging dialogue and action towards environmental sustainability. Submissions must be uploaded by this week, the 15th of October, and that's the website, greenstorm.green. It's the world's largest cash prize in a photography competition, so please do apply. There's a category for professionally taken photos as well as for mobile phones. So for the next steps on the Land Restoration Challenge, the first step would be to sign up for the challenge and the UN Decade. We have a sign with a QR code in the back booth, so please do. You can scan it and then fill out the form. You can also go to our website, g20land.org. The first meeting will be held virtually on the 17th of October next week, so please do sign up before that meeting. And we also hope to plan an in-person meeting in Bonn sometime in 2024, so hopefully we'll be able to see you there as well. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and apologies for the technical issues. Thank you. Great, so now you've heard about the UN Decade and the Land Restoration Challenge, and so now I want to introduce Patience Namara. She's the Country Director of Fair Venues Worldwide, FVW Uganda, and she is leading action on the ground on the implementation of the UN Decade. So Patience, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. And quite privileged to be here, to sit with the guys at the top. We're happy to be associated with the UN Decade of Restoration. Thank you. I have a presentation that I hope I'll be able to. Thank you. No pay though. Okay, so if you could go to the first slide. Yeah, thank you. So Fair Ventures Worldwide is an NGO with headquarters in Germany, but we operate in both Indonesia and Uganda, and I happen to sit and work in Uganda, where we have our vision and mission as, having good forests as climate solutions. And if you go to the next slide, I'll show you what we think a good forest looks like. So we think a good forest should have those qualities and should be able to provide not just the trees and ecosystem services, but also provide livelihood for the communities, which tells you that, yes, I work very closely with my team, with local communities on the grassroots level. Next slide, please. At Fair Ventures, we work along the entire value chain of forests or trees, and that photo should show you what we mean. It should be a full cycle. Next, please. Okay, so I'll take you quickly to what we do, how we implement our programs in Uganda. We have nurseries as the centers of whatever we do, and we have so far since 2018 established 16 community nurseries. These are run and operated by community members. Okay. By community members, and these are located across the country. I can't see what I'm talking about. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks. So our smallholder farmers are grouped into groups around the nurseries. We start with communities that are closer to the nurseries, and this has helped us to minimize on waste or damage to the seedlings when we transport them, for example. So each nursery on average has about 60 farmers every season, and we work 2 seasons a year. That's the April to June season and August, September, October season, which are the 2 rainy seasons we have in Uganda. And for those who are conversant with Uganda, we operate in all those districts so far. And since 2019, we have already hit our 1 million mark of trees planted, with a survival rate of about 70%, which I think this is no mean feat. And we are able to know this because we're actually doing the monitoring using both ArcGIS and Trio. I don't know how many of you here have used Trio or have heard about Trio. Good, thank you. Yeah, this is a product of Fair Ventures as well. Next slide, please. So just quickly to show you where we've been and where we are now. This was our first test field in 2018 in a place, in a district called Hoima in western Uganda. The first photo is when we had just planted, and the second photo is how it is as of 2 months ago. Next slide, please. Now, this is one beautiful place that I really would be happy if I could manage to take all of you there. So this is how it looked like in 2018 when we visited the first time when we visited the site. It was bush, and it had been cut down. And the next year, 2018, people had started growing crops, and we had introduced to them the inclusion of trees. Next slide, please. This is 2 months ago. This is how this place looks, and I'm proud to say you won't find such examples if you are not working very closely with the communities. We're proud of the communities that are doing this work. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to restoration projects and all programs. We have shown you before what we do with the smallholder farmers, but we also have a component where we work with the government in the central forest reserves. And in this, we have two categories. There's restoration with smallholder farmers who have been given land, allocated land, degraded land from the CFRs, that's the central forest reserves. And so far, we have a group that we are working with since since last year anyway. And we have so far planted 42 hectares out of the 52 they were given. And we hope that we should be able to complete this season, this rainy season. The other one is a CFR, a Central Forest Reserve, where we are working together with the National Forest Authority. We've been allocated 1,000 hectares, and we have so far covered 30 hectares. And we hope that once we are done and they are happy with the work, we can be added another hectares to make them 3,000 hectares. And next slide, please. Okay. So that open land was once a forest, as you can see. And this was degraded, cut down eventually over a period of, say, 5 years, not even 10 or 20, but 5 years. And that's how it looks like now. And we're now working with these smallholder farmers who came into a group and they were offered this land to restore. And I think in the foreground you can see some small seedlings that have just been planted. So we are supporting this group. Next slide, please. Now, this is what it looked like before it was cut down. This is our common challenge. It's sad. Every time I look at this, I want to cry. Every time I go there, I get so emotional. So we hope that maybe in another 10, 20 years we can have the forest back. Hopefully. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, quickly to what we have learned from these restoration projects. We made mistakes at the beginning. We learned from them, and we are good to go now. And I'm proud to share with all of you what we have learned. Maybe it might be helpful to someone who's in this. So we realized that community involvement in decision making is very key, because once you involve the communities, it creates the confidence among the communities to know that they are valued and they are thought to be able to make this happen. It creates the trust and also project ownership, because believe me, and I know all of you are in these restoration programs, if you don't have the trust of the communities, if they don't think they own this, it won't work. So when we started, we outsourced the purchase of seedlings. We bought from as far away as Kampala and far off places, because that's what we knew. And we had a lot of mortality transporting these seedlings. We were not sure about how they will raise the quality of the seedlings. But ever since we set up our own community nurseries, it has not only improved the livelihoods of the communities that run these nurseries, because we facilitate them to run these nurseries, we train them, and then we buy the seedlings from them. So the money goes back to the communities. So it is something that has taken us very great strides, and it has also reduced the mortality rates we would have otherwise incurred while transporting these seedlings from far off places. Working closely with local governments. We all know that governments have programs related to these projects we do. But for the most part, I don't know about your countries, but for the most part, these local governments are underfunded or do not have budgets for these kind of activities. So we work closely with them and facilitate them wherever we can. And it has proved very helpful, because they are closer to the ground than we are. They have the authority because they are government. And so they help us, they backstop, they give us technical advice, and also step in when we are not able to be on the ground. Then we also made mistakes at the beginning, where we brought this, university graduates from the universities, from the cities, and sent them to the field to go and talk to the local people in English, and for those who speak French, in French. And how many of these people have gone to school or understand the language you use? Who knows restoration in your language? Anyone knows restoration in your local language? Okay, so that's what we did. We came in and spoke a lot of jargon, and these guys didn't understand, so they didn't pay attention to us. So when we started recruiting staff, bringing back their children who studied and have come back to work with our communities, it made a very big difference. And the communities trust these people, they know them, and it has also taken us big strides. This is something you can learn from. And then, the big elephant in the room. So these guys give us money, and we don't want to disappoint them. So we keep on telling them lies. Yeah, we have the trees, they're on the ground, everything will work out. Yeah, we shall give you 1,000 hectares in 2 seasons. Trust me, half the time it doesn't work out. Nature has its own surprises. The people have their own surprises. Life takes over, and you're not able to meet the targets as promised. Be honest with the donors. Tell them what you have on the ground. It saves you a lot in the long run, and makes work easier and less stressful. Those are the lessons that we have learned, and I'm very happy to share with you. Then we had challenges. Trees are trees. They have their own life. They don't bend. They don't, they work at their own speed. So if you thought growing trees was like growing beans or maize, you're in for a shock. Trees take a long time to grow. They have different needs, which a lot of people do not understand. So some of these farmers will come to you and say, oh, we want to grow trees. We want tree A, B, C. We have mahogany. We want, all these beautiful species they know are high value. What they don't know is that it will take 50 years for you to get this tree to give you the money you want. So once he realizes 3 years into the ground, the tree is not taller than he is, he cuts it down. Say these guys they're frauds. They told us would gain money, would earn money from these things. This is fraud. I mean, so we have learned that, and how have we worked around that? We have worked around that by doing trainings, both before the distribution and the planting, and also after. The first trainings we do is to tell them about the benefit of the trees and blah 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 blah, the things we always do. Then we teach them how to plant them and what to expect, and the spacing, and which crops can grow with which tree species. And then the next time we come, that is after the planting, we tell them about how to manage these trees they have planted, how to keep them in the ground, and how to benefit having them alongside the other crops. Then the other challenge we have is seed sourcing. For indigenous species, it's quite difficult to find someone who can give you good seed, which is still viable, because half the time you get seed and the germinability has been compromised because it has been kept for a long time, or it was collected in an unprofessional way. So how to manage this is by training local people how to collect and store these seeds, and also to work with already established companies that are doing this, so that they can give us the expertise, or they can give us an assured source of good seed. Okay, so I think this is common with all people working with local communities, failure to appreciate technology, but also maybe because the technology is not constructed to fit the needs of the people that we are working with. You're talking about an app, which certainly that must be a smartphone, and the app developers come with all sorts of specifications. Very few people of our local people can afford phones of that kind. So either they are not able to use it, or they think this is just too much for them and it doesn't work out. So we are still working with this, for example, with the service providers who we use for the monitoring app, the technology. Then working with the institutions has also been difficult on our part, where we have worked with churches or schools or other institutions that have big chunks of land. How this comes about is, I'm sure a lot of you know about the tragedy of the commons. It belongs to no one, and it's no one's responsibility. So you plant with the churches, with the schools. It's no one's responsibility to take care of the trees. Maybe schools close for holidays and there's no one to take care of them. Someone brings in their animals and they feed on them, or a new management comes up who's not interested in tree growing and cuts them down. So we have had challenges with that. But the main challenge has come from maintaining the trees in the field. The farmers we work with are really my grandfather, your grandfather, my uncle. I don't know about your uncles and your grandfathers. Mine are poor, and they do not have a lot of money to spend on clearing fields of trees. So they'll clear what they can, and the rest will probably be left in the bush, and that's how we lost almost 30% of the 1 million trees that we planted. And of course, Mother Nature, droughts, floods, and all the other attendant effects of climate change have been our biggest challenge. So next slide, please. Thank you very much once again. And we are very proud to be associated with the UN Decade for Restoration. And thank you, UNCCD, for inviting us to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patience, for that engaging presentation. It's great to hear about the impact that you're having on the ground, and I love how you had the before and after pictures of the restoration projects as well. We had an online media seminar prior to GLF, and the journalists were very curious, what does a successful restoration project look like? So it's great that you provided all these examples, so thank you for that. Next, we have a speaker who will be joining us virtually, Eric Ombija from the Ecosystem Restoration Alliance of Kenya, or KERA. He's the founder and CEO, and he's also a member of the UN Decade Youth Task Force and a global co-lead of the Food Challenge. So Eric, are you with us?
Also insights, lessons learned from our work, and also our engagement from across the globe. So basically, I've been much engaged in the youth work, where we work closely with young people, that is youth and children. And specifically, I'll start with the UN Decade Food Challenge, that is more of youth-led. So the UN Decade Food Challenge focuses on regenerating agriculture, that is restoring and regenerative productive ecosystem across the globe. And our emphasis is specifically on the local communities and vulnerable groups. So the UN Decade Food Challenge is organized around 3 main pathways, though through our interaction with the youth and local communities across the globe, we got a feedback that we really need to add another pathway, action pathway, that is pathway number 4, that focuses on sharing knowledge. So the first pathway is focusing on leveraging ecosystem restoration efforts on ecosystem restoration communities and camps. Then the second pathway focuses on how do we establish world-class and youth-centric ecosystem restoration communities and camps. Then the third action pathway focuses on what we call the zero hunger refugee camps. When we were doing our work before we submitted the proposal to the UN Decade Secretariat, the people we engage with across the globe gave us a strong indication that when it comes to strengthening the food systems, we really need to focus on the communities that are left further behind, or the vulnerable groups. So in our assessment, we found that refugee camps, there is need for us to work up to 2030 to ensure that we transform these particular refugee camps into zero hunger hubs. So that's the name came, zero hunger refugee camps. So the first focus, that is leveraging on ecosystem restoration camps, we really want to work with the communities, because we believe that for us to succeed, there is existing and promising already capacities with the local communities. And we really don't want to reinvent the wheel, but rather we want to work with the people, that is the local community, so that our focus is place-based and also context-based. So we have been mapping out different communities that have been doing promising works on when it comes to regenerative agriculture. Then we, as the food challenge, we see how best can we really bring in that ecosystem restoration perspective and insight using the eco-restoration lens to advance whatever the existing efforts that various communities and local actors have been doing for years. So we have various projects in different countries which we have mapped out and which we really want to advance for greater impacts. So we have identified projects in Uganda. You have identified projects in Spain, for example. We have identified programs in Kenya. We have identified programs in Turkey. That is the one of the fragile areas. How can we also make them become food secure? Then when it comes to the second action pathway, that is establishing new eco-restoration camps and communities, what we call the new generation pathways. We call it the new generation pathways because our youth said that for us really to regenerate and restore the ecosystem and meet the ambition which the UN Decade Ecosystem Restoration has really set, that we really need to bring in the new perspective, that we really need to abandon the business as usual. So our youth said that we really want to set up the 5 different ecosystem restoration camps that can showcase our perspective as young people on what eco-restoration communities look like. So we have a pilot through our proposal we came up with a pilot which is supposed to be start in Kenya. So this particular challenge brings in, we use what we call the multi-criteria assessment, which bring in different criteria so that we can bring broader community so that we don't leave anyone behind. So when it comes to ecosystem restoration camps, the first one of its kind is called the Victoria Eco-Agri tourism communities that will focus on restoring degraded land, and also how do we bring and strengthen the ecosystem restoration so that it can also attract the tourists. So how can we make the tourism sector become eco-conscious? So we have been doing site visits in various areas to identify which sites can we really restore. And last week, together with our partners from the ecosystem restoration community camps and movements, we were privileged to visit various regions in Western Kenya, that is in Kitale. We were also in Homa Bay County. Kitale is in Trans Nzoia. Then we were also in Homa Bay County. The Homa Bay County, we met the various communities and the various stakeholders, specifically the county government of Homa Bay. Then we identified various degraded lands that we really need to set up and align to this particular proposed program. And the one good thing we really got, one critical feedback we got from the ground, is that various actors, even those in the public sector and the governments, have strong will of collaborating, and so that we can make ecosystem restoration works and succeeds. So in Homa Bay, we identified a land, a degraded land, up to 300 acres. The community have agreed to contract this particular challenge, 100 hectares. Though, and also the county government of Homa Bay, though there is still consultation on this, so that we can agree on the specific hectares of this particular degraded land that we can transform to food hub. Up to, they have agreed up to, we are up to 200 hectares of land next to the Victoria region, that is the lake. So that is action pathway number 2. When it comes to action pathway number 3, that is the zero hunger refugee camps. So zero hunger refugee camp, we have also mapped out up to 10 refugee working actors and communities. One is in Uganda. We also have in different countries, so that we can transform this. We'll work together and transform this particular refugee camps, so that we give the refugees and the host community the power to define what kind of food system they really want to have, so that they can define the food they eat from the seed up to the plate. So that is something we believe, that refugee camps should not really rely on humanitarian support, but they can also, when they find a home where they can call home, they can also be given the opportunity to define what kind of productive system they want to create in those particular refugee camps, so that they can also become food sufficient. So that is an important area. So when it comes to the Kenya ecosystem restoration, which I was introduced about, the Kenya ecosystem restoration is bringing different community-based organization majorly. So we want to leverage on what this particular community-based organization does. So we have 47 community-based organizations as affiliate partners and members of this particular alliance. We have 6 founding members of this particular alliance. Then again, we focus on five areas of focus. That is, 1, we have holistic and responsive education. We believe that we really need to sensitize communities, institutions, and everyone to know about ecosystem restoration initiative and the under the UNDA framework and strategy, so that people can really take up the responsibility to restore the ecosystem. Then the second area of focus is regenerating local agri-food systems, where we really focus on agroecological approaches. How can we advance this to have a food secure country? Then the third one is inclusive business and philanthropy. We want to work with the private sectors, which we have been continuing to map out, so that they can also invest back in nature in restoring the Kenyan ecosystem across the country, especially those ones which are much lagging behind. Then we have the fourth one, is called sustainable nature positive cities. So we believe there is a way we can make our city become nature positive. And we have a strategy. We are still, our team and technical team specifically are drawing a 5-year action plan on how this can be achieved. So how can we have even food hubs and agricultural hubs that is multifunctional. So specifically, we shall be focusing in the cities of Kisumu, cities of Nairobi, cities of Mombasa, and of course, the city of Nakuru, and the other one is Eldoret, which is also being upgraded to become a city.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you. Sorry, if you want to wrap up now.
Yes, I want to wrap up.
Thank you.
So when it comes to the fourth area, the fifth area, I mean, that we have what we call the local system strengthening. We believe that we have needed capacity, we have communities have the needed capacity to do our work. So our work is just to bring communities and actors together to do the work of ecosystem restoration. For example, an interesting project which is...
Sorry, Eric. Sorry, we have to cut you off because we have very limited time. But thank you so much for that presentation. It's great to hear about your work as a leader in your community, including for refugees to eliminate zero hunger. Thank you. So a round of applause for Eric. Thank you. And now, last but not least, I would like to introduce Miranilini Rai, who's the Director of Women for Biodiversity, and she is an advisory board member of UN Decade.
Thank you so much. Really glad to be here. Sorry, unfortunately, I did not prepare a presentation. So I want to take in key elements for the discussion that I think, John, you also talked about in the beginning. So I'm going to focus on one key element around it. Is that first is on synergies. I think we really need to discuss upon how synergies should be made, because as you said, there are different commitments within different conventions. You talked about the UNCCD, then you talked about the CBD's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and then the Global Landscape Initiative. So I'm going to focus my work with this. What I engage in is the Convention on Biological Diversity. Before I go through acronyms, because sometimes in meetings we use a lot of acronyms, how many of you actually know the CBD? Do you know what it means? Great, so I can use the word CBD. How many of you are aware of the KMGBF? All right, so that means I need to expand that. Okay, so the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, after having delayed its COP15, the Conference of the Parties, last year in December, adopted this ambition, the blueprint for biodiversity, which is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, this framework is to guide the vision of living in harmony with nature until 2050, but to achieve that, you have 23 targets which are supposed to pave that path until 2030. So, because you talked about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, within that, the 23 targets, you have target 2 in particular that talks about restoration of 30% by 2030. So what I really want to focus is that while we are talking about restoration, I want to take a little bit of a holistic approach. And I think some of the elements I'm really happy to see that I see from the GLF coming up is a growing recognition that inclusiveness is really important. That means that we really need to make sure, like you said, it doesn't go ahead if we really don't have the ownership and the participation of local communities. And I'm going to also be talking about indigenous peoples and local communities. And my focus within that larger scope are gender, the aspect of gender. And sometimes we tend to know that there is a gap, but then get sidelined because sometimes gender is supposed to be mainstreamed. So you really don't have concrete actions, right? Like, what should you really do to ensure that women have access to economic incentives, or women are going to if you're going to have these groups of restorations, how many of them are women-led or youth-led initiatives, right? Because you're talking about 1 billion hectares, and a lot of the communities are very small. So I say that, if you should be able to count those initiatives, and they're not going to be started. And I think I heard during the day that there are these initiatives that are already existing. what they really need is a support and the recognition and funding, right? Like that's why you need to upscale it. But you really need to also see that how these small pieces of the puzzles can be supported also, not which could contribute to the larger commitment instead of also focusing just on the larger restoration, because communities can't do that. Yes, indigenous peoples can do that, provided they have the enabling environment that recognizes their rights to the lands and territories. And if you do that, then maybe they will just do that because 80% of the biodiversity is found in the lands and territories. So I think this is really very important for us to link up this work with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and then also looking at this because the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework within Target 2 exist is that the convention has a principle, it has a guideline of how it should be done. And one key element which I really think needs to be broadened up here, they sometimes say that, oh, Tina, it's just knowledge, people should know about it. But I think we really need to reiterate it in every session we get, is human rights. Though we are looking at a target to so-called, address land neutrality and contribute to somehow regenerating degraded lands and territories, we really need to make sure that to happen, for us to take benefits, we really need to ensure that the rights holders become part of that. So the GBF talks about human rights, it talks about gender responsiveness, and of course it has a very strong input on recognizing the roles and contributions and recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities, and I'm going to keep stressing that on. So within that, and I want to link this up with the work of the Global Land Initiative, because in the GI also you presented, and I saw your quick chart, the Global Land Initiative also actually has a very strong gender component in it. It talks about empowerment, it talks about participation, it says that women are agents of change. But for me, it was really very interesting how those components of women's rights are reflected in the projects. And I think you talked about monitoring of, somebody talked about how do you really monitor that these projects are going to be good, is an indicator whether these GLI projects or upscaling has this component that really looks into first, are there violation or FPIC, that's the free, prior, and informed consent of that is under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is adhered to? Because sometimes, we talk about inclusiveness, and we sometimes forget that. I tell people, like, inclusiveness is a very difficult thing at times. And that is the reason why you look at women's rights movement. You're talking about youth. You're talking about indigenous peoples. What is the key demand? That is like a baseline that I've been hearing for 10 years. Participation, participation, participation. So when we're talking about inclusiveness and being partners with them, we really need to really hold ourselves responsible of what does it really define us. Then you also have, my time is almost up, but this is where I really just wanted to give a broader just view on what is really important and these key principles, and just to also hook it into that there is of course the UN UNGA resolution on the right to a clean, sustainable, and a healthy environment. And I hope that that is going to be something that would be, of course, decade on the restoration, but the GLI also adheres to some of those indicators that would amplify the synergies, right? Otherwise, we are making different commitments within different spaces, but again, we'll be working in silos, because all these projects in different spaces, different geographical locations, can contribute, but also recognizing that these restoration initiatives play very differently in different scapes. So also challenging that the way that you would develop a project really needs to also take that into consideration, how they're going to be implemented. Like you always say, right, one shoe does not fit all. So they have to be taken to the context, the political will. That is another big challenge. Coming from a region where I see some regions making advancements, say for example, Escalzo Agreement, right, which access to information, and even including justice, while as I come from Asia, where it's also a very large region where you span from all the way up to the east and all the way to the Pacific, right? Like it's a huge geographical location. And then how do you really address these? And these are very important, the social, economic, cultural inputs into making sure that the restoration initiative is truly bound by making sure that everybody is a partner in it and not just something that is big and is an indicator of like chick boxing and saying, okay, we did this. I'll end at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheena, for highlighting the importance of human rights for Indigenous peoples and for women, and particularly for Indigenous women and girls, right, who face multiple layers of discrimination, and also the importance of an inclusive approach. So thank you so much for our panelists and for also Eric, including who's first joining us virtually. And now I wanted to open up the floor to our audience to see if you had any questions for our speakers today.
Hello, thank you so much for those great presentations. Patience, you have the perfect name for this business, right? Takes a long time. Thank you for sharing so openly. We say in Kiswahili, kupanda miti ni rahisi, lakini kukuza ni ngumu sana. To plant a tree is easy, but to grow it is much more challenging. So this is a very challenging space. My name is Sarah Scott from the Kilimanjaro Project, doing ecosystem restoration at the foothills of Kilimanjaro, focused on community carbon projects linking smallholder farmers to the global carbon market, and riverine forest restoration. So my question is to you, Jean-Philippe, is how do we become a member? I remember some years ago when you guys launched, like it was really difficult to get in touch with the UN Decade Office and apply. Is that process become more open and easier to engage? So I'd love to know that. And then once a member, how do you actively keep your actors participating and feeding in to the partnerships?
You want me to respond right away? Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your question. So it took a bit of time, of course, to set up the partnership framework of the UN Decade in the first place. Obviously, it's quite an endeavor. What we work now is, I believe, with quite an inclusive, indeed, partnership framework. Inclusiveness comes through empowerment, so that's a very, very good point we could touch upon afterwards as well. But what we did not have at the beginning, and what we struggled a tiny bit, was to include the heroes on the ground, or in the seas, really, as such as yourself, in terms of onboarding through UN standard processes, including due diligence processes, etc., which are rightly in place, don't get me wrong. What we, I think, now managed with the UN Decade through its new power approach is that the partnership framework includes one key, and actually the biggest category now, to include so-called actors. I've quickly touched upon them at the beginning. What that means is they are non-vetted partners, and that is actually great. Well, because what it means, it allows us, and it gives 90% of all the possibilities that any other partners would have as well. We have quarterly partner meetings. You will be in practical terms on the key distribution list. You will be included in all the consultation rounds. For example, when we came up with the flagship initiatives, that is not something solidly cooked, on a bureaucrat's desk. No, it was really a joint effort of the entire partner network, and that is the same with the action plan. So also these partners are then empowered to act on behalf of the UN Decade, and that is something extremely important. So let's follow up right away. I'll grab you right after this panel and let you know the details. And this is, I'm glad that you asked, because I really want, if you take one thing from us, for me as a partnership coordinator today, is that if your organization, if your entity is not yet a partner, really do consider it. In average, it takes roughly, from the time that we receive the application form, which is rather easy and doesn't prelude, doesn't exclude anything that we'll do in future. It's rather to get the conversation starting. Once we receive that application form, it usually takes not more than 3 weeks for the approval, if the partnership committee, of course, approves. Each partner has to sign up to international standards in terms of respecting human rights, community engagement in restoration. So obviously, all that is standard driven, which it must be, but I'm sure that your organization already includes that in your work. So please take that as an invitation that if you're not yet a partner, we'll follow up on that. Let's have a discussion, because there's a reason why the partner network is as large as it is. Thank you.
Thank you, JP. Do we have another question?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Felipe. I'm from Brazil, but I'm actually based on Nottingham-Trent University in the UK. And I have a comment to share, and I would like to hear from you some thoughts as well. I have a dual feeling when I'm seeing these presentations, because on one side I'm very happy to see the results on the ground, the empowerment of local communities, taking care of this agenda of restoration, the gender accountability, everything else, it's perfect. And but on the other side, I am a bit concerned about the flagship, for example. When you see the map of flagship projects, there's not a single project in the Global North, only in the Global South. I understand that the Global South has the most of the biodiversity and the challenges for restoration, etc., but it gives, to me, a sensation that, yeah, we are not committing, the Global North is not committing with it. Let's flagship the good projects out there in the Global South. You take the responsibility for the restoration and the healing of the world, and we can finance you. And to me, it's a very concerning message, or very annoying, not say, because I would like to see more commitment in terms of not only for funding, or because we know where the funds comes from, but in terms of how to do locally as well for them. I mean, in terms of flagship actions as well. So this is a comment I would like just to share and to hear from you what you think about it.
No, thank you for that comment. You know, a lot of the G20 countries are also in the global north, and so we'll consider your inputs when designing activities for next year. And so I don't know if any other speakers want to address that question about the flagships. Yes.
Just very quickly on the flagships. Thank you. That is absolutely correct, and I couldn't disagree. I couldn't agree more. How do we define global north? You will have seen that we do have high-income countries as flagships, right? So just to say, there are high-income countries definitely in the first batch of the flagships. There will be in the next batch of flagship announcement coming up during UNEA. But it's a very good point that we had an overrepresentation, of course, in the Global South in terms of nominated projects. But they cover, also particularly now going forward, they cover all countries. There's one region, North America, which indeed was very underrepresented in the first call. But I'm very hopeful that this will now change. And we have, you know, in some gap areas identified in the first call for nominations, such as urban ecosystem restoration, for example, we have a program now in place proactively on this, and you please stay tuned, because we do have flagships in that area and in the global north indeed coming up, right? So I can only agree with your concern, which we had shared, but can also promise that flagships do cover the global south as much as the global north.
Thank you so much for your comment, and JP is going to be like, what are you going to say? But thanks a lot. No, I think good to know what the flagship, but I just wanted to respond to what you really talked about. I definitely do really hope that whatever the initiative is, the UN Decade Restoration, the Target 2 or the GLI, and I think it's very correct, and this is a discussion maybe we should be having, because see, my concern is that the restoration should not be a target, and I was putting it very mildly, as a tick box, should not become a pervasive incentive, right, to get away with certain obligations. So that's my worry, because yes, restoration has taken up a very high, is growing up there. So that is, I would say, not a safeguard to really, like, I think what you were talking about, right? And I think from my perspective about the restoration, and especially these larger scales, including in Brazil, right, that they should, putting in kindly, or maybe I'll be abrupt, is saying that my concern would be that the restoration is done with the inclusive and the rights-based approach, but it does not become a form of commodification of restoration initiatives into carbon markets. Right, because okay, from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, I'll give you an example where you have restoration by Target 2. You also have a very complicated target called area-based target, which is Target 3, which talks about sustainable use. So there's a larger conversation, but I definitely agree that this should not become something for give and take, because one of the key elements of restoration, including in the biodiversity, the 3 pillars of biodiversity, is not only conservation, but key element that we absolutely miss sometime in the discussion is around customary sustainable use, right? People always talking about, so it's not like you do a restoration, it becomes a forest, and you're like, okay, what's the carbon value? But you have the relationship of saying that this is something that people's lives depends on. I think your example showed that, you know, livelihoods depend upon that, and that key element. So you're talking about sustainable use, customary sustainable use, and the other element of CBD is actually access and benefit sharing, which may come into the restoration initiatives if there are certain elements. And I'm talking from my perspective from the CBD, like you have Target 3, then you have climate change. How will you mitigate climate change? Let's look at the restoration commitments, and you know, there are these huge 1 billion hectares lying there, the 30 by 30. So I don't know whether I instigated the discussion, but it is something for what we are trying to keep track on, is how these good initiatives do not become a phase for anybody to take advantage of, either the private sector or agriculture or states in that matter. That's helpful.
No, thank you. We're running out of time, so maybe we had a question here, and then you can go next.
I'm Govind Paudel from Nepal. Looking at the discussion here today, I have quite a little bit different out of the session question. So I think the UN Decade of Restoration, there might be a risk of reducing that campaign into a mere plantation projects, and another one is the risk of local communities becoming more marginalized. So I'll give 2 examples from Nepal. It may not be relevant to other part of the world, but we had the same restoration plantation project 5 decades ago, 50 years ago, and that failed. And then currently Nepal has increased forest cover by 5%. It's not because of plantation, but because communities have rights, they are given the rights to manage the forest. It's solving the problem of the tenure, so giving 100% right to the communities. So the campaign, UN Decades campaign and partners network worldwide, the targets of 1 trillion hectares, whatever, we have to be aware that restoration is not only plantations. There are so many different kinds of things. So it should be a kind of customized to local areas. number two is we had a Red Plus program. That's a pilot program. The carbon kind of protecting carbon, restoring carbon, and selling a kind of big things. But when it is translated into the practice, so local people are told, okay, you don't have to cut trees, you don't have to take the fuel out of it, because the carbon stock is decreasing. It decreased the carbon stock. So at the end of the day, the local communities are becoming more marginalized from that very, very good global carbon project. So my suggestion is to become aware of these risks. So UN decades should be come up with a broader kind of ideas that restores the forest. So otherwise, there is a very risk after project is gone, it's everything gone. So we can't get that target. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Marlene Soriano from Bolivia, and really nice presentations and discussion. I appreciate that, and something that we are really being very careful about in our work. I work for the Bolivian Institute for Forestry Research, and we are also our main allies since some years ago are women organizations, and we are working in political and economic empowerment with them. And that is something that just was mentioned, is that how do we work with these women groups? It takes a lot of time, but also a lot of recognition of the roles of the different indigenous central organizations that in some way we see them as allies for these empowerment processes that have already been taking place in these sites, and learning about that and understanding these power relationships has been very key for us, and supporting also the women organizations on designing how they want to achieve their goals has also been key. Being able to listen and to support that, right? And in this, I see, like it says, a land of opportunities. I think this program can, in many ways, support that empowerment processes. But understanding these roles are also important for us, especially in areas where we work, where access to forest rights, forest resources are mainly taken by men, led by men. And at the end of the day, there are very few examples in my country that has over 20 years of access of indigenous peoples to the forest. But there are the women are still getting access to these areas, trying to get access, and we just had this opportunity to support a women organization to actually have access and rights to this. But the recognition of roles have been very important, and this taking into account these processes also, and that can lead to this further, more just relationship that does not damage the established relationships either.
No, thank you so much for the comments from our audience. We actually have an event in the afternoon at 2 p.m. on women in land restoration, so definitely I'm sure you'll be interested to attend. And so I hope I invite everyone to join us for that session. So maybe as a closing, each of our panelists can give a quick 1-minute summary to address the comments as well as to close the session.
Right, closing remarks. So thank you to all my co-panelists, of course. And it's really an honor to sit here with you. Why? Because you represent the diversity that comes together behind the UN Decade, right? In terms of partners, also the types of partners that you represent, from the advisory board, the expertise, etc. I take just one question with a quick response, which is a very real risk, the risk of marginalization when it comes to large-scale restoration projects. And that is exactly why under the UN Decade there have been principles having been published and now standards for the implementation of restoration projects that include exactly this, that include criteria for governance, for inclusivity, for community engagement and leadership. And when we talk about the flagships are not selected randomly by a core group behind, in some offices. They are being selected and rated based on a scientific process, and this scientific process is based on exactly these principles. Are we where we want to be? Maybe not. There's probably always room to improve, but please let me really assure that these are concerns that are also on each of our mind engaged in this process, and that is why that's why principles and standards have been created exactly to this point. Well, from my end, a big thanks again, and I'm looking forward to many much more discussions on this. Thank you so much.
I will not respond, and maybe after the meeting I'm happy to actually connect. And these are really very key point. I'll again stress on the same thing by saying that it is a good opportunity, but we just really need to make sure that it doesn't get greenwashed in some ways, right? And further marginalized communities and including women. I just want to put in closing is because I'm supposed to also really target on looking at the gender perspective of that. And as you, colleague from Bolivia talked about, that women are there. It's not that they're recognized, but there has to be an enabling condition to really make their participation effective, and that's what we're really looking for. So I told people that, women are half the world's population. So come on, it's time to act now. We're talking about hope. I'm like, oh my God, I'm losing hope now. I shouldn't, but it is time to act now. I mean, the World Economic Forum says it's going to take us 300+ years to reach where we are. And this is the argument I make that, this is why we ask for the spaces to talk about women's rights. I tell people, because we always asked, good practices of contributions of women to restoration, to blah, 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 blah. But I always say that I don't think there's any study that says that this is a man's contribution to conservation. But you'll see a lot of good practices by saying that, because they always ask me, Tina, can you share a good practice of women are carrying out conservation? So just on that, I always tell people, women's rights are human rights. They have a time to live in dignity. We all have that responsibility and states of accountability, and those rights are non-negotiable. So I'll end at that.
Yeah, thank you. For me, I think the GLF is getting more and much better. For the fact that we have more youth and more women engaged, not only at high-level discussions, but also at the grassroots. So yes, JP, to answer your question, yeah, the world is in the right hands. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe there's some members of the Ecosystem Restoration Alliance of Kenya in this room. If you can raise your hand. Well, they're at the Global Landscapes Forum. So, there's some back there. So if you have any questions on the Alliance, please do see the colleagues in the back. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this session. As mentioned, feel free to go to the back of the booth to scan to join the Land Restoration Challenge, and we'll cross-check with the UN Decade to make sure you're all partners of the UN Decade as well. And you can also sign up for our newsletter, the G20 Global Land Initiative newsletter on our website, g20land.org. And in the afternoon, as mentioned, we'll have another session on women and land restoration, so we can continue these great conversations on gender perspectives in land restoration. So thank you so much again for coming to person, and thanks to those joining us online.